Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Hour of History podcast. This is your host, Stephen Bauman. And this week I have for you Dr. Carrie Gibson. She is recently off the release of the new book, El Norte, the epic and forgotten story of Hispanic North America. She's also the author of other fine books such as Empire's Crossroad. And it was a true pleasure to talk to her. Definitely relevant conversation. Glad to have you with us. Thanks for subscribing as always on Hour of History. It's our world, anytime, any place. Enjoy.
You're listening to the Hour of History podcast, Our World.
Anytime, any place.
For show notes, links, and more, be sure to visit our website at www.hourofhistory.com. And for all the book recommendations made during the podcast, head over to hourofhistory.com/rex. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. Without further delay, your Hour of History starts right now.
So joining me today is Dr. Carrie Gibson, who's just written El Norte, the epic and forgotten story of Hispanic North America. Welcome.
Hi, thank you for inviting me.
So I've got a lot of questions first, but why don't you just start with giving us a little background on who you are and sort of how you came to the study of history and the study of Hispanic America.
Okay, my route is a little bit non-traditional, I suppose. I was born and grew up in the US, but I've lived kind of my whole adult life in Great Britain, in London mostly. And I worked as a journalist. I studied journalism, and then I worked as a journalist for The Guardian and other places in London, and later went back to school to do a master's and then a PhD. And that was my entry kind of into history. And what I wanted to work on and focus on was the Hispanic Caribbean. And this was in part because I had learnt Spanish in school in the US, which is something I bring up in El Norte, because my school saw an influx of mostly Mexican children in the mid-90s, but we also had a very strong Spanish department. So I'd already had sort of Spanish language, and then I wanted to build on that because I realized that Cuba and the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico all had fascinating histories. So I worked on that for my PhD. And the Caribbean took me into my first book, which was a history of the Caribbean. But with El Norte, I kind of wanted to actually revisit my earlier time in the US and think about where the US is. I'm going to say in this moment, but I actually started this project sort of 4 years ago. So kind of for the particular moment we're in. And it also was a great opportunity to extend into Mexico, which I hadn't worked that much on. And yeah, that's like a very compressed version of how I got from there to here. So
yeah, and you seem to have the ambition to tackle these massive projects. I mean, the first book, The History of the Caribbean, and now the history of North America. What is it that draws you to sort of this approach where I'm going to cover a lot of time and I'm going to cover a lot of space?
It's a couple of things. I mean, I think that partly comes out of working as a journalist and thinking about narratives and these longer connections. I mean, even though there's daily news, they connect to these longer running stories, right? And at the moment, we're seeing two enormous kind of stories unfold on either side of the Atlantic. You know, one is the change in the White House and how that's been playing out since 2016, and of course the other in Britain is Brexit. So even though there's daily news, we're also thinking about it in this sort of longer sense. And obviously history's full of historical writing like that. And I was I've always kind of enjoyed these larger narrative histories, but of course, doing a PhD, you have to focus, on a much more specific question and delve much more deeper into the sources. Now, in a more pragmatic way, some of it is just how these things play out when dealing with the publishing industry. There is definitely an interest in kind of bigger narrative histories rather than more specific kind of monographs that maybe we'd be used to as readers and researchers. And so I found, quite a welcome audience for it as well. So it's kind of a combination of things. I mean, obviously as a writer, it's wonderful to work across so much time, but as a historian, it's really daunting. And I absolutely have to use lots of secondary sources, and especially for periods that I'm not a specialist in. I tend to focus in the 18th and 19th century, so things that are 15th and 16th century. I absolutely depend on secondary literature, of which there is a ton. In the Caribbean and in Mexico.
Yeah, and I've certainly heard and talked to a lot of people, and I have my own experiences of these regions tend to like work as tractor beams and just pull people in, especially Cuban historians and things like that. Just because there's so much good work already done on it, that so it is a sort of daunting challenge. Now, El Norte is a big book, and you did take on that challenge. Can you talk a little bit about setting the boundaries for that book? Because every historian has to eventually decide what time and place it's going to be in. How did you sort of conceptualize this?
Well, one of the things I really wanted to do is, and this feeds into the kind of conceptualization, is I really wanted to make sure that the story of Cuba and Puerto Rico specifically becomes part of this bigger narrative. Because when we talk about sort of Hispanic, United States, everybody sort of thinks Mexico. And I wanted to kind of show that there was a much broader story, as well as obviously connect it to the history of the conquistadors and of Spain itself, which again is something that has tended to fall by the wayside. It was very difficult because, like I say, I prefer the 18th, 19th century. And so, how much did I want to talk about Cortez in Mexico, for instance, and that kind of those early years of the conquistador. But the more I got into it, the more I realized, well, this is absolutely crucial because, these are people, and certainly I'm thinking of Oñate in New Mexico, and then the sort of settlement of St. Augustine as well in the 16th century. I mean, this is all stuff that happens before the sort of English really arrive in any significant numbers on the Eastern Seaboard. And of course, in the United States, there's such a narrative about, this nation being kind of founded, the Pilgrims. And it became very, very important to work on the 16th century stuff, for instance, to counter this, to go, well, actually, no, the Europeans who were here first weren't necessarily, were not the people from England. So, so that kind of forced me again out of my comfort zone in terms of periodization. I mean, I knew I kind of had to start. You kind of had to start with Columbus, and with Empire's Crossroads, I faced a similar challenge. And in that case, I kind of even went back further, and I had to go even before the Spanish Reconquista in Spain. I had to sort of really think about what was going on in the Iberian Peninsula, and I bring an element of that to El Norte. And then going in the other direction, I felt that I couldn't finish this book without taking in the events of 2016 and the election, the presidential election. Mm-hmm. And the discourses around Hispanic people in the United States today, as well as people who want to immigrate and people who want to seek asylum here. So, so there was a lot of, it was a long time span.
Yeah, and I've always been intrigued with this idea of, one of the things your book does really well is that it kind of, first of all, it's approachable and readable, but it also periodizes. It fits nicely with a lot of survey courses. And one thing that would be interesting is to kind of teach American history from this different angle. I'm always interested to see how American historians are actually teaching American history, and this is certainly a different approach where you're looking at places that aren't typically conceived, how many textbooks or whatever start in Santa Elena or, in these different locations. So I think that's interesting. And maybe it's the sign of changes starting to happen. Now, one of the things you have to confront right away is terminology and language that we use. And it's right in the title of your book. What is Hispanic?
It's such a fraught question. I know. And I tried to tackle it in my introduction. And of course, this is a debate that, has quite a lot written about it. And Hispanic is a word that is not particularly well, it comes with its own, problems. I mean, and it's interesting because as I've been giving book talks and promoting the book, people have been asking me, so can I use Latinx? Can I use Hispanic? And I'm like, this is still all up for discussion. The reason I chose Hispanic is because I wanted to use a word that very specifically evoked the actual sort of hand of Spain, if that makes any sense. What's interesting about the Latino, Latina, Latinx identity is that's something that comes out of the experience of being a Spanish-speaking immigrant or descendant of immigrants or descendant of people who had been in northern Mexico before the Mexican-American War. It comes out of that different experience, and it becomes a bit more of a political identity. Now, some people would argue that Hispanic is that too, but it also has connotations. It's been criticized because it has connotations of being a very kind of imagined as a white term rather than one that embraces Afro-Latinidad or indigenous history. But I used it because it's contentious, I think, as well. I wanted to pick up actually what does this mean? And, when we talk about the Hispanic world, when we talk about Latin America or Central America, I mean, there's so much diversity in that, that it also, of course, raises the question of, are these titles even useful? Are they serving purposes? And at the moment too, we're having such a kind of national conversation again about race and the differences between race and ethnicity. And I kind of wanted to raise that without, I guess, coming to any really firm conclusions, but my use for it was to try. I thought it was the word that best kind of bridged the Atlantic, because I wanted to make sure that in talking about what some people kind of conceptualize as just the border, when they think sort of Mexico or Latin America or Latinos, I wanted to make sure that it reached all the way across the Atlantic. And of course, with that comes the longer history of colonization, the longer history of the slave trade, and the longer history of, indigenous genocide. So, that's why I chose the word. But yeah, I spent a lot of time mulling over it, definitely.
And in all fairness, you do explain it right in the beginning and sort of your justification, which is something that a lot of people I've noticed have kind of just skip over and sort of assume the reader should be on the same page, which is there's too much discussion for that assumption to be made. Moving on in the book, you do start with this example of a guy who's kind of good with pointing out how silly some of these terms are within Christopher Columbus, who's kind of been used by a number of nationalities as their sort of main figure. Can you talk about how you chose to approach the first encounters?
Yeah, I mean, Columbus is such an interesting figure, and this is the reason that he still holds a fascination on us for us. I think you have to. I kind of didn't want to start with him initially, sort of for the reasons you were saying. It's kind of like, well, can't I just shorthand this? Doesn't everyone know this? And my editor was like, no, you have to go back to the beginning. And I realized, yes, he's right, I do. And because Columbus is the figure who despite, I mean, obviously there have been claims that the Vikings showed up in sort of the northern North America before Columbus arrived. There's sort of different contestations over who actually arrived in North America first, but Columbus is crucial because he's the one that causes what we think of as the encounter, right? And with that, there's no, not only does he set the tone, there's also no going back. He doesn't kind of go, well, this was really interesting. It wasn't Asia, because of course he got all his sort of, navigation wrong. I'm just going to retire now. I mean, he comes back. they try to settle a colony. I mean, he also sets the tone for what's to come. So in that sense, he is a pivotal figure. But it is interesting how he gets reinvented and readopted throughout the years, with the Italians trying to take credit for him at one point, as a way to acknowledge their place in US society in kind of the early 20th century. So this is how you get kind of Columbus Day, and of course, in the past 20 years, he's been completely revised. And there's been a lot of backlash against ideas of, celebrating Columbus Day. And certainly historians have absolutely taken a very critical eye to those much earlier histories of the encounters between the Europeans and the native people of the Caribbean, and then obviously later the native people of North America.
Mm-hmm. And this is one of those areas where it seems like just every word, I mean, most all of history is this way, but every word seems to carry with it so much weight. You have to be, so careful which words you're using to describe which places, and sometimes you have to use multiple words. Now, in your approach, in the way that you build up this book is through cities and through it's almost a case study approach. How did you choose where to go?
Well, one of the things I guess I really wanted to do, and I try to do it as well in Empire's Crossroads, is go to kind of key historical sites and kind of see what was there, and then use them as kind of a way to explore certain themes. And it was really hard to decide. I mean, some of it was easy, right? I'd never been to New Mexico, so I knew I needed to go to the pueblos of New Mexico. But when I got there, there's still quite a lot of pueblo villages, and I needed to work out, well, which ones do I need to see? It always is kind of a case of constantly refining what you want to do and see. But I've lived out of the country most of my adult life, so most of my travel has not been within the U.S. So I had a ton of traveling to do. I had never been to Texas. I had never been to California. I'd never been to New Mexico. But even rediscovering places in the South, and I grew up in Georgia and Tennessee. So for me to go to St. Augustine and to go to Santa Elena, the Santa Elena site on Parris Island was also really fulfilling, because it's a part of Southern history that I wasn't taught at school, or if I was, it was so brief that it didn't make an impact. And like you were saying earlier, I really hope people who teach history, this sort of inspires them to think about how we frame, European settlement in what becomes the United States and how it unfolds. But I spent 5 months traveling. I also went to Mexico, and I went to the border region, but then I also went to Mexico City as well, because I just needed to spend some time there. I felt like, I wanted to see certain things before I actually sat down to write. And it's something I did in Empire's Crossroads as well. I mean, I spent a lot of time in the Hispanic Caribbean when I was doing my PhD, but I had never been to Jamaica, I'd never been to Barbados, and I went to those places for that book. So maybe, I suppose that taught me the importance of seeing places. And one of the, and it ends up kind of paying off, like in my chapter about Mesilla, New Mexico, I found this etching, and I kind of start the chapter about this, and this is late 19th century. It's after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and it's about how there's a survey for the train companies that are going out there, and one of the artists does this etching of Mesilla, and it looks like this forlorn village. But if you go back to written sources, it says it was a place of 2,000 people. It was like these kind of different. And then of course I went there myself as well, and saw kind of its physical sort of appearance today. And so putting, kind of knitting these things together, a sense of place is, I find, kind of indispensable, but it's an enormous luxury, and I mean, I think all historians want to spend more time in the places that they work on. Yeah. But I thought I had to, and I wanted to get a sense of, the scale of the border, too, having not spent that much time in the West. And so, an enormity of that landscape, because its enormity becomes part of the story as well. From the Spaniards not being able to get enough people to settle the northern frontier, in California, because there's just too much resistance from sort of various indigenous people to the idea that nobody's in the West, when we have mid-19th century Manifest Destiny. So all of these different things kind of come out of the vastness of the West in the Southwest. And I had to experience it for myself, basically.
Yeah, and that certainly that's a thing that you would encourage every historian to do, is go and kind of see it. I know it's changed the way I approach research when I kind of see and feel, and you kind of calculate things that you wouldn't have considered otherwise. You shift after talking about the arrival and the initial sort of, it is a strange word to use that I'm even a bit uncomfortable saying, encounter. Really it's a clash and a war. But after this arrival, we move to this period of independence where flags are coming up and going down, borders are shifting, laws are changing. Did you find anything in that period that surprised you about the interactions between, say, Hispanic North America and Anglo North America?
Well, I think one of the biggest stories is how Spain actually plays a pretty important role in supporting the American Revolution. France gets a lot of credit, but Spain was running money and goods. Through the back channel, you have Galvez and Pensacola, you have, ships coming up from Cuba. And again, it's one of those things that's kind of mentioned in passing, but, when we think about and how, when people of Hispanic origin are discussed in this country, it's put very separately from that. That's like, oh, well, that was Spain and that was a long time ago. But it's like, it's on this historical continuum, because we're all very merged together. At the same time, when the various independence movements across Latin America are taking place, the United States and people like Jefferson are kind of watching with a wary eye. I mean, at some level, they obviously, are flattered that there's discussion of republics being formed elsewhere and that sort of thing. But on the other hand, there's a lot of not particularly flattering things said about, countries that had come from Catholicism, because, this is one of the things behind it as well, is that as the 13 colonies turn into a nation, the sort of Protestant identity becomes a very important component. And of course, the Spanish world is still seen as Catholic, and and the Spanish world still, after the 7 Years' War, owns, controls the Louisiana territory. So this is something that's actually, abutting this new nation is still, Spain is still controlling, for the most part, the hemisphere. So, and of course, the way that the American Revolution is presented, it kind of positions the United States as this new powerhouse, but it becomes, that's a process. It doesn't happen immediately. It's completely surrounded, really. And making sense of that was definitely one of the, trying to explain that, I guess, was one of the goals of the book, because that sort of late 18th and early 19th century sort of movement across the hemisphere is not as sort of clean cut and linear as we expect, and it wasn't necessarily all one way. I mean, certainly people looked to the United States for inspiration, but there was also influence going the other way. And certainly Simon Bolivar became a very popular figure for a while in the U.S. and so also that interchange, especially in the 19th century, the early 19th century, is interesting too.
And you mentioned it briefly right there, and I think it's such a good example of this sort of crossroads is Louisiana. And you do spend quite some time on Louisiana, and not just New Orleans, but going to the river between what is now Texas and Louisiana, and you talk about the sort of, well, it was a colony of Spain, and I think it's very easy to forget, because at least in the typical sort of text is the Louisiana Purchase story from the perspective of, say, Washington. So is New Orleans a good sort of like turning point spot for this independence conversation?
I think so, because so many factors come into it, and it's interesting on many levels, because one of the things that kind of fascinates me as well is how New Orleans is reimagined as always being French. It's a French
Mm.
city. It's America's French city. Well, okay, it burnt down. The Spaniards rebuilt it in 1731, I believe. I think it burnt down twice actually, and I write about this in the book. And then the people that we call French, a lot of them were refugees and planters, and also free people of color, and also some slaves who were brought, enslaved people who were brought as well during the Haitian Revolution.
Mm.
So this idea, I mean, yes, obviously Louisiana was founded by French explorers, that all is there, but it's always kind of in the way it's where it sits in the, US popular imagination as this French place, but I see it as like a Caribbean island. I consider it just like all these overlapping histories. And then the Louisiana Purchase, it's just skipped over. It's like, oh yeah, there was Louisiana and it was French, and then Napoleon sold it. But Napoleon swindled it back from Spain, who made him promise not to sell it. And the reason, of course, he sold it was that he had bankrupted himself in part trying to take back the colony of Saint-Domingue during the Haitian Revolution. So all these things are like knotted together, and it's not that clear cut. And Spain kind of has this ongoing problem throughout its time as sort of an imperial power, which is it just could not get people, it could not really get settlers to live in its frontiers. So, when Mexico City and sort of Peru, when gold and silver is found there, and Potosí, these places were like hubs of activity, and they obviously attracted a lot of people, but far fewer people wanted to go to Louisiana or Missouri or, outposts. And so what you get in a lot of these places is that it required different types of interactions. It required some sort of tolerance of, say, small French traders who were already in parts of Louisiana. It certainly involved lots of different negotiations with indigenous people like the Creeks in the Southeast. And it also involved trying to keep a sort of peace with the British, and that all kind of falls by the wayside during the American Revolution, because obviously they're helping the Patriots. So you get a lot of sort of skirmishes in Florida, and of course Spain and Britain have this ongoing, centuries long sort of love-hate relationship, mostly hate, I think, sadly. But it's a long contested history. Louisiana is an interesting turning point, but it's also an interesting example of these kind of various layers and how complex, U.S. national identity becomes. It comes out of these forces, and this is why, I think as a Caribbeanist, I certainly saw Louisiana as like this natural extension, and its history felt very familiar to me in a way that when I started doing work on, say, New Mexico or California, that felt different. That felt very different. It felt much more an extension of Mexican history. And then the thing is, obviously, these are all connected now in the U.S. national history.
And I really appreciate that section of New Orleans and coming from the sort of Caribbeanist perspective, because even teaching at the undergraduate level, I have students all the time who are just totally stunned when they learn the Haitian Revolution and just how connected things were. I mean, Haiti's not that far away from Cuba, which isn't that far away from the United States. Or what was Spanish territory at the time. So it's really neat to kind of see those connections drawn out a little more. And I think hopefully we'll see more and more of these kind of Caribbean to United States connections, historians working on. After this sort of like very interesting and very tumultuous independence time where borders are being redrawn, we get to a period where there is some national identity has been formed, and it's a period of much greater movement. The third sort of section where you're talking about immigration. Can you talk a little bit about that, the period, I guess, of movement of immigration?
Well, there's the period of immigration, and there's also the period of internal migration, and the turning point of this is the Mexican-American War, because it basically allows the U.S. to to reach the Pacific, when it loses. And of course, I mean, when people find out, with the gold rush in California, for instance, and the sort of development of the railways into the West, and with, surveys finally coming back. Because the other thing that you have to bear in mind too is that there were a lot of spaces on the maps of unknowns. The Spanish tried, like, other, like, imperial powers tended to do in their territories, tried to map and control and make sense of places. But, North America is vast. And there were definitely still some blank spots on Spanish maps. And of course, Lewis and Clark were famously celebrated in the US for their trek. But it takes a while to kind of work out not only what are in these places, but what these places can do. Are they fertile? Are there rivers? What can be put here? So with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, this cedes 51% of Mexico to the United States. And it opens up this territory for westward movement. So you have that, but then, as you say, there's also the question of immigration. And one of the groups I do want to talk about is, and I spend a chapter on this, are the Spaniards, because Spanish people still end up coming to the United States until they kind of dwindle down because of quotas in the early 20th century. And they're part of the mix of that kind of classic late 19th century mix that we think of, Italians, Portuguese, Polish, that comes to the United States. The Spaniards are part of that mix. And there is this moment in the late 19th and early 20th century where there's kind of a Spanish craze again in the United States. And a lot of it's centered around New York. And I wanted to bring that into the book to kind of show that, Spain's not out of the picture just, after the independence of most of the countries in Latin America. Also, it's not out of the picture because Cuba and Puerto Rico are still colonies, and they're still very close to the United States, and that doesn't come until 1898. So actually, Spain isn't written off after the Louisiana Purchase. Far from it. And I think, again, that's kind of forgotten.
Yeah, absolutely. And the whole idea that that these identities are constant and these borders are constant, you show it shifts until it's always shifting, even to the present day. But you mentioned just briefly there the quota system. Can you speak a little bit about that?
So I want to say, I'd have to look at my notes to definitely get my dates right, but I believe it was the 1917 Immigration Act that started to put some quotas on various groups of people. And one of the ways they calculated it is, I believe, that it was a percentage of the population of people in the last census. So say there was 1,000 Spaniards, you could have like a quota based on like 10% of that. So it naturally reduced a lot of groups who didn't already have connections here, who were like new immigrants. So I want to say that's the 1917 immigration law, and that changes. Spain kind of dwindles off, but at the same time, a lot of Spaniards end up going to Cuba, they go to Latin America, and so the immigration just shifts south. And the other thing I should say as well is that a lot of European immigration that we think comes to the US, which does, also shifts south. So this is around the same time you get a lot of Italians going to Argentina, for instance. You get a ton of different people going to Cuba because Cuba's economy is starting to pick up, and that goes well into the 20th century. Likewise with Mexico, you get certainly in the 19th century, Chinese people, especially after the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, start crossing the border actually to go in and out of the US, but also going to Mexico. And so, the continent is like one of movement. And with that movement, like you say, these identities change, and new identities are formed as well.
And why do you think in a lot of, typical narratives, people don't tend to focus on these areas of the United States, especially in the early 20th century? I mean, you write about, Texas and Florida and Los Angeles, cities that that tend to get a little more ink as we get later and more towards the present. Why do you think that is? And do you think that you've made an argument to sort of change that a little bit?
I mean, I hope I have, in the sense that I think scratching under the surface, it just kind of shows the composite nature of the nation. And, one of the things that the whole continent has in common is this kind of mosaic history, right? Because it was disrupted in such a profound way with the arrival of Columbus, and also with the forced enslavement and the forced migration of people from Africa, and these are two enormous factors in the subsequent development of the country. But some of it is a case of scale. I think digging up the Spanish past, for instance, in southern Illinois or Missouri, the scale isn't there in the same way that we can talk about the foundation of Los Angeles under Spanish rule, and then its place in sort of the Mexican Republic, and then becoming a U.S. city. So I think with some places these histories are kind of forgotten because there's just not as many people who keep the history going. Partly because too, especially in the early 20th century, the push for Americanization. How many generations does it take? And I bring this up in the book as well. Are you still Hispanic if you don't speak Spanish? How many generations does it take before people just become the nation they live in? And one of the things I try to do in the book a bit is kind of meditate on the idea of the nation, because we think the nation is like this, ancient thing, and it's not. I mean, the modern nation state is still an experiment in many ways, and it's part of a kind of post-Enlightenment modernity. So that's so different from when you're thinking about Europe and kingdoms and that sort of thing. So I guess part of what I was also trying to meditate on is what does it also mean to be American in the hemispheric sense, from the US, and American in that kind of sense, how the word's been adopted. But yeah, also just like what is a nation?
Yeah, and it's a question that you could certainly people have spent their careers trying to figure out. And I think it's very interesting. At the beginning of this conversation, you started with mentioning interest in Puerto Rico and Cuba. And Puerto Rico and Cuba are two parts of the world that seem so connected to the United States, but at the same time kind of excluded from the United States narrative in many cases. Maybe if we can get a little more towards the final section in this post-World War II, what are some of the changes in the way that Hispanics are viewed in the United States happens after World War II?
Well, after the war, and a bit before it, but mostly after, you start to see some quite high levels of migration from Puerto Rico, which at this point is a Commonwealth colony of the United States. It was ceded, the U.S. took it after the Spanish-American War. Cuba kind of presents a slightly more interesting, not more interesting, but a more complicated question, because the linkages are much longer. So Cubans were coming back and forth to the U.S., throughout the 19th century. There were prominent groups of exiled Cubans in places like New York and D.C. There were people who were fighting or arguing for annexation to the U.S. This is before the Civil War. It's kind of a way to extend slavery to the South. And all of that was going on. And I think people think of Cuba as like Fidel Castro in the Cuban Revolution. But these linkages are very, very old. And that's not to say that's not the case with Puerto Rico. It's just that the scale was bigger for Cuba. And I would probably argue longer. But then Puerto Ricans, nationalists often would go into exile in the U.S. as well. So the U.S. has always kind of been that place. But yeah, after the Second World War, the dynamic changes. Puerto Rico's economy is devastated by hurricanes, which we see how that can happen. Maria was a very timely reminder of the devastation that can cause. You had Operation Bootstrap on the island after the war to try to increase productivity. Later on, tax breaks were given in Puerto Rico for like pharmaceutical companies to invest there and set up factories. So there was some efforts to develop the island, but people could also just make more by coming to the U.S. And after 1917, Puerto Ricans were given U.S. citizenship and under the Jones Act. So they were U.S. citizens. And what was so fascinating about Hurricane Maria and kind of the conversation around it was, there was some poll that came out that showed that almost half of the U.S. didn't realize Puerto Ricans were U.S. citizens. And that, was a real eye-opener because, is Puerto Rico included in, say, the high school curriculum? I don't know, because I don't teach in the
probably
US.
Not. Yeah.
And again, with Cuba, it's always like, well, Fidel Castro, the Cuban Revolution, and it's like, well, yeah, all that's there, but there's definitely a longer story with Cuba, and again, longer connections. And what I found really interesting was the 19th century immigration from Cuba. A lot of the cigar workers, the cigar plants moved, and you had people moving to Key West, Tampa. Miami is a much later thing. Miami develops much later, and we think of it again, it's like, well, Miami's always been Cuban. Well, but Tampa was actually more Cuban earlier on, So again, there's a longer and richer history, I think, than people realize for both of the islands.
And it's very interesting to see you draw out these connections and between things that were said 100 years ago and things that are being said today. One of the things that is frequently used is in a slang sort of way is referring to Hispanics as brown. And can you talk about how that's problematic and how maybe that it changes or American perceptions change in, say, viewing Cubans and Mexicans, even though both are, part of this narrative in many similar ways, as different?
I mean, I think anyone who has spent a great deal of time in any country in Latin America, be it Cuba or Argentina or wherever, will get a clear sense of that pretty quickly, that everybody identifies themselves by their country of origin, not as Latino necessarily, and that there's enormous race problems throughout the entire continent. So a lot of the racial hierarchies that we have in the United States are actually kind of replicated in many places. Sometimes it plays out slightly differently. So somewhere like Mexico, for instance, I'm always shocked when I'm there at like how the adverts, everybody looks kind of European, Spanish. There's not people who look indigenous, who are indigenous. There's certainly not very many Black people, for instance, represented in things, and that's kind of throughout the region. And this is quite sort of problematic. And then, people come here from these places or are descended from, people from these places, and they face dealing with this category of brown, right? Like, what does this mean? And one of the moments that I was very intrigued about, and I write about it in one of my 19th century chapters, is when California joined as a state, and they dropped the Constitution, and they're like, okay, well, white men can, free white men can vote. And it becomes a question of, oh, wait a minute, are these Californios? Are these descendants, who are these people who were living here when it was under Mexican rule or Spanish rule before that? Are they white? These landowners, these dons, are they, wait, and it immediately raised these questions of like, well, what is white and what is brown is kind of never really determined in the West. But you do get this informal Jim Crow type stuff that plays out throughout the Southwest. So, no Mexicans in this restaurant, or, Mexicans have to sit upstairs. So Mexican kind of becomes this shorthand as well for brown people. And yeah, I mean, it's super complex, and it remains that way. And I think as well, because all of these questions about color and race and, Blackness and indigeneity come out of the colonial encounters of of the entire hemisphere. It comes because we all have a very shared history, with slavery, with indigenous genocide, with colonial rule. And so we have all these things in common, and everybody's trying to kind of figure them out. And it plays out differently in different countries. I mean, certainly somewhere like Cuba has at least acknowledged that there has been, that Afro-Cubans were long discriminated against throughout history. And the revolution, has kind of said there's no racism, so this is not part of the revolution. But everyone who goes there realizes that there's still structural inequalities that exist that often put, Afro-Cubans at the bottom of the structure. So everybody's kind of, I feel like every country I have been to in Latin America is dealing with very much of the same kind of problems that we are trying to make sense of in the United States as well.
Interesting.
Brown becomes this space, that I, that again, like Hispanic, is very much open to.
Yeah. And it's interesting to see, especially, and then the question becomes, well, when are you going to start drawing your lines? You bring the book up without giving it any of it away. I think everyone listening should go buy it. It's available right now in fine bookstores everywhere, and Amazon, of course. But you bring it to the present, and you bring it to the present in areas of America that seem to be frequently in the news, Arizona and Georgia. Can you talk about your decision both to bring it to the present day, like you said, it was always sort of a driving feature, and then also to Georgia?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to kind of cut it off around the last election, but what became so clear was that there was a very negative discourse around Mexicans, around Latinx people, about Southern immigration, that I just kind of thought, well, I'm going to have to wait and see who gets elected and how this plays out a little bit. And I also wanted to, spend a little bit of time looking at the Obama years, because Obama came under, he did come under criticism for his immigration policies. Some people saw them as too harsh. Some people saw them as not harsh enough, of course, but I wanted to get a sense of the numbers. Actual Mexican immigration has declined, as everybody, as we just, as has been very much mentioned recently in the immigration at the moment that we're seeing is from Central America. And of course that, the instability of some of those countries goes back to, the 70s and 80s and involves U.S. policy in places like Guatemala and Honduras, Nicaragua. And so I didn't have space to go into a lot of Central America. Like, I definitely wanted to focus on, Mexico, the border region, and Puerto Rico and Cuba, and bring in other places as and when I could. Arizona I chose because it seems to just be the point where a lot of this converges, right? It's a place where a lot of people are crossing without papers. They're trying to cross the desert to get into the country. It's also places with actual border crossings. It's a place that was part of Mexico before Guadalupe Hidalgo. It's a place where people are very anti-immigrant. It's so full of contradictions, and it also has a history of legislative things like the sort of bill that they passed to stop people and ask for their papers. That provoked, I want to say it was State Bill 1080, that provoked a lot of controversy. And so I thought that Arizona was kind of one end of where everything is. It's one kind of end of the discussion. Georgia is somewhere in the middle, but the reason I wanted to bring in Georgia is because, I went to high school there, and during my time there, it was the NAFTA years. So I graduated from high school in 1994, and in the 90s, you started to see definite shifts in labor patterns. And the town I grew up in, Dalton, Georgia, is the carpet capital of the world, and so it had a lot of jobs and carpet mills back then. And there started to become this stream of people coming up to work. And interestingly, there was also a program to sort of teacher exchange, because it became very apparent that the schools I went to needed, people who could teach English as a second language, and things like that. So, and I grew up Catholic, so the Catholic church I went to started having masses in Spanish, and this is all happening in the 90s. Now it sounds pretty, this doesn't sound particularly surprising, because this is now happening, or has happened, in lots of places in the South. And we are seeing that shift with Spanish-speaking populations, and certainly kind of more recent immigrants going to places that are not, New York or LA or places in Texas. They are coming to the Alabamas and the Georgias, and I think that's super important to think about, because again, it's about joining this kind of national fabric. And we can no longer think about the South of the US as a non-Hispanic place. It absolutely is. It's absolutely part of that world now, outside of Florida, which, has long been considered, a place with a lot of Hispanic people. So I definitely wanted to bring in Georgia as well, partly because it, connects my experience to the book, but partly because it also represents these non-traditional spaces that are now becoming the new normal.
Yeah, and speaking of the new normal, one of the sort of statistics you bring up is that there's predictions that there's going to be nearly 140 million Spanish speakers in 2050 out of 430 million. So, almost half the country is going to be Spanish speaking. Now, anyone who's traveled to Canada knows you're greeted by a border guard who says hello, bonjour, and then you get that option of speaking French or English. Is there ever going to be a time where you come to the United States border and you're greeted by hello, ¿cómo estás?
I'm just trying to think if I've ever used Spanish coming into Miami. I feel like Miami definitely, for me, I speak Spanish as a second language, but I'm clearly like a non-native speaker, right? Mm-hmm. So when I speak, people know that I didn't grow up in a Spanish-speaking household. But I feel like Miami is the most bilingual city, without question. You can just walk around and switch between the two. And I'm trying to think if I've ever used Spanish at the airport. But it wouldn't surprise me if I had. You know what I mean? Because I feel like so naturally a place where you switch between the two. And I think that's going to, again, when we talk about new normals, and I think a lot of the border is a bit like that, but the Dalton, Georgias are going to be more like that in the future. And I know there's resistance to it. And again, this is something that's part of a national, that needs to happen as part of a national conversation. And interestingly, it's one that Britain has had at various points as well. Where does the English language fit into national identity? But with so many Spanish speakers, I think even at the moment, the US is the second largest Spanish-speaking country. If you take the, 40 or so million at the moment who speak Spanish, that puts them right behind Mexico, and I think ahead of Spain. So, even if you took everyone out and put all of them in California at the same time and called it a country, that would be more Spanish speakers than most Spanish-speaking countries. So we've got to think about it like that as well. For me, again, it's this natural connection to like the rest of the hemisphere. Obviously there's Portuguese too, and I don't deal with the Portuguese empire of Brazil in this book, but again, there's 300 million people who speak that language in the hemisphere as well, and it's part of this is about people in the U.S. thinking about not only their place in the U.S. but their place in the world a bit more broadly.
And now your book is almost 600 pages, so I feel a bit rude asking this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What's next?
Oh my gosh. I am playing around with quite a few ideas with my editors at the moment. I think probably return to the Caribbean, a bit more specifically. But what I really like to do is delve into Haiti a bit, and also a slightly thinner book. I have plans down the road for other bigger narrative histories, but I think they do take a lot out of you. So I think about a smaller project on the Caribbean. I've definitely got some ideas about Cuba, but right now with Cuba, so much is going on that I'm kind of waiting and seeing what's happening. It's a very interesting moment there right now. So
yeah, absolutely. Cuba and Puerto Rico are having fascinating moments, and then Haiti is always interesting. Fantastic. Well, unfortunately, we're drawing close to the end of the hour here, but fortunately, we get to the suggestions. So, yeah, what would you like to suggest to the Hour of History audience?
Oh, I think what I'd like to suggest is, first of all, just to think about the idea of the United States as like a Latin American country, right? To think about this longer, more connected history, rather than like, well, we're the US and then there's everyone else. It's like, well, we're actually really, really connected. So if we approach it from that way and we kind of meditated on it a bit like that, I think it can change some minds or some perspectives about, certain aspects. The other thing I would say is and I know travel is very much a privilege and a luxury, but within the US, you can really experience a lot of this Hispanic past, without having to necessarily fly to Mexico or fly to Cuba. There's something around you. You live in Alabama, then, there's like a highway that's called the DeSoto Trail. And like some of this is kind of a later, there's a little bit of a not invented tradition, because there's a sense, there's a bit of, we don't actually know where the trail was. We're going to guess it's here. But, there's every place, there's nowhere in the US that was not touched by something connected to this history, right? So, even if you live in Illinois or you live in Missouri, like there are things, you can seek out. And I do try to write, this is why I do include so many kind of what seemingly out of the way places that aren't, and to kind of understand and connect with that history. It is there, and actually the National Park Service is absolutely brilliant about this. They ended up being such a great resource. But I would say for anyone who's interested in this history, get out there, go to where you can go, because you will find something that connects to this Hispanic past, and certainly our alternatively, of course, engage with our Hispanic present, right? Especially if you live in if you're not in Miami, you're not in LA, it's in some ways it's even more important. So
yeah,
so I
great.
guess that's my two suggestions.
Yeah, no, those are great, and they go along with the book, and that's one of the reasons you should read it, is because it has these stories. You may not have ever known that the Spanish forayed into the Pacific Northwest until you read the book. So those are excellent suggestions. Another thing the book does well, and this is my suggestion, that kind of goes along with the travel suggestion, is I really appreciate maps. And your book has a lot of excellent maps, and I think people should spend time just looking at maps from different periods and seeing how the borders, the names, the nations, the people, and the representations of who lives there change. And I think you could have a whole class, you could have a whole book, you could have a whole study, and people have whole careers looking at maps. And I would urge everyone to just take time, and like you said, you can start in the present with Google Maps, which is a fantastic resource, and then work your way back from there. So
oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, and there's so many historic maps online that you can kind of go where your curiosity takes you with that, definitely.
And then both of those suggestions together, and you could have your own 600-page book after many, many years of work and a PhD. Well, is there anything else you'd like to add before we sign off here?
No, just to thank you for inviting me on.
Well, thank you so much. It's Dr. Carrie Gibson, and the book is El Norte, the Epic and Forgotten Story of Hispanic North America. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
On Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place.
Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to check out our recommendations page at hourofhistory.com/recs. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. There you'll find links to the books mentioned during the podcast, and if you choose to purchase one, you'll be supporting the podcast in the process. And if you still haven't gotten your fill of the Hour of History, make sure you head over to the Hour of History blog, found at hourofhistory.com/blog, with articles being released fairly often on topics relating to those covered in the podcast as well as others. With that, we conclude this episode and hope to have you back for the next one. Take care, and again, thanks for listening to the Hour of History podcast.